Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 5th Asia Global Institute Public Policy webinar. I'm Heiwai Tang, Associate Director of the Institute. The AGI Public Policy webinar series invites leading scholars from universities and think tanks around the world to present current research on global public policy issues and discuss the implications for Asia and the world. The speaker of our webinar today is Professor Pol Antràs, Robert G. Ory Professor of Economics at Harvard University, where he has taught since 2003. Professor Antràs is the world-renowned expert on international trade and global supply chains. He's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, where he served as director of the International Trade and Organization Working Group. He's also a research affiliate at the Center for Economic Policy Research, as well as a member of CESIFO Research Network in Germany. He has served as editor of the Quarterly Journal of Economics and Journal of International Economics, having previously been on the editorial board of various leading economics journals. Professor Antràs has published over 30 highly influential articles in top economics journals and is the author of the book, Global Production, Firms, Contracts, and Trade Structure. He was the co-director of the World Bank's World Development Report for 2019 and 2020. Among other distinctions, he was awarded an Alfred Sloan Research Fellowship in 2007, the Fadishian Banco Hirari Prize in 2009. He was also elected Fellow of the Econometric Society in 2015. Global trade has experienced various setbacks since 2008. First, it collapsed during the global financial crisis. Then it was slowed down by protectionist policies enacted by several major economist governments in recent years. We all know how global production and supply chains were disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemics, which have been significantly restructured during the pandemic and will probably encounter even more challenges due to anti-trade sentiment and policies in the post-pandemic world. In the first half of today's webinar, Professor Antràs will share his views about the future of globalization and how global supply chains would be restructured in the post-pandemic world based on his paper, De-globalization, Global Value Chains in the Post-COVID-19 Age. After his presentation, there will be a Q&A session moderated by me. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to type questions in the Q&A box. I will try my best to direct your questions to Professor Antràs during the Q&A session. Please take it away, Professor Antràs.
Thank you so much, Heiwai. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's an honor to speak in front of everybody here. And I'm particularly delighted to do this with Heiwai, who is my PhD student more than a couple of years ago. I forget exactly how many. And I'm very proud of all his accomplishments. So let me tell you a bit about what I want to talk about. And I'm just going to give you a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about. Do you see my slides? No, because I haven't shared them yet. Okay, so let me know if you see them.
Perfect.
Great. So let me start with a roadmap of what I want to tell you about. I'm going to start the presentation by very quickly reviewing certain trends, recent trends in the global economy. And I'm going to be particularly interested in answering or providing some answers to two questions. First, have we entered a phase of deglobalization, as some commentators are arguing? And B, and relatedly, are global value chains retrenching or renationalizing, going back to their origin countries? In the process, I'm going to speculate on the future of globalization and of GVCs. I may moderately speculate, but if you push me a bit in the Q&As, I might be even more cavalier. In doing so, I also have some slides towards the end, time permitting, in which I'm going to quickly touch on the issue of the role of the current health crisis in shaping all this, in shaping the possibility of deglobalization. Now, there's limited time, so I wanted to point out that I'm building on a longer piece that I'm mentioning here in the slide. If you're interested, if you want to dig deeper on any of the issues that I'm going to talk about, please go to my website and feel free to kind of take a closer look at that article. All right. Now, before I get into the recent trends, every time I have a presentation with the word future in it, I get a little bit nervous. So I always like to remind this beautiful quote by Galbraith, who was a Harvard professor of economics for many years, who argued that the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. Meaning, you know, you need to treat any predictions the economists make with some caution. Now, having said this, I don't want to downplay what I have to say, in that part of our goal is to understand past events, current events, and based on that, analogies, empirical evidence, conceptual frameworks, to try to make some predictions and present some scenarios that might play out in the next few decades. And that's basically what I'm going to try to do here. So let me start with the facts. Before we talk about the future, let's see how we got here. Okay, and in particular, I'm going to try to assess the extent to which there has been deglobalization in recent years and recent decades. My punchline here will be that I am not convinced that we have yet entered a phase of deglobalization, and I'm not sure we will, but we certainly have not entered that phase. There has certainly been a deceleration, a slowdown in the rate of growth of globalization, but that's very different from a process of deglobalization. Let me illustrate this through a variety of ways. So the simplest way to do this, perhaps, is by using one measure, which is, to many, it's like a canonical measure of trade, of globalization, which is the degree of what we call trade openness, that is the percentage of GDP that is accounted for by trade, either exports or exports plus imports or the average of both. And what this figure is showing you is showing that, yes, in the 70s and especially in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, there was a very significant rise in trade openness in the world. Globalization was taking off. Now, what we saw is what Professor Tang mentioned a minute ago, which is the trade collapse of 2008, 2009, but there was a very fast rebound. And even though globalization has not gone back to the trend it followed in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, there's no significant evidence that the level of globalization measured through this measure of world trade over world GDP is any lower today than it's ever been. Okay, so yes, certainly a slowdown in what we saw in previous decades, but no deglobalization.
Oh,
now
sorry.
Yes.
Do you mind to maximize your PPT? Make it full screen if you could.
That's very strange. I thought I had. Let me try to share again. Thank you for pointing this out.
Oh, sorry to interrupt.
No, I would much rather get interrupted than. Okay, so now that's a problem. All right, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to maximize it. Do you see it bigger now?
I see it bigger, but I see two slides at the same time. Like, is there a way to shut down the note?
Is this better? No?
No, it was the same as before.
Let's try this.
Oh, now this is great.
Yes?
Thank you, perfect.
You should have told me before, sorry. Yeah, I did exactly what we did before we started it. Okay, so if this is good, then let's proceed. So the first substantive point I want to make is not just that globalization slowed down in recent years, but that this was, to some extent, this was inevitable. That is, the idea that the level of globalization could have continued to rise at the same pace that it grew in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, that is simply not tenable, okay? And the reason for this is that even though technically it's not a percentage, the ratio of world trade to world GDP technically is not a percentage, it's close to a percentage in the sense that there's natural forces that are going to put an upper bound on this ratio. Okay, there's a maximal, if you will, level of globalization. So the closer we get to that maximum, obviously growth has to slow down in the same way that when a percentage grows and grows, at some point it has to taper off because it can't go over 100%. So what I'm going to argue is, in a little bit, is that, in my view, the interesting period to study is this massive period of globalization in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. We want to review what happened here, try to understand why this is not operating anymore. And once we've understood why it's not operating anymore, trying to figure out whether these things that are not pushing globalization any further might continue to get stuck or might actually start to work in reverse and lead to a true process of deglobalization, which would reduce this measure of trade openness. Now, before I do that, let me quickly show you a couple of other measures. You might be thinking, well, that's one measure of globalization, but there's many others. And indeed, there's many others. And I want to show you that for some, the message is very similar. For others, admittedly, it's not. But I am going to conclude that this notion of deglobalization at this point in time doesn't seem to have much empirical support. So a second measure other than trade openness I can show you is the percentage of world trade that is accounted for by global value chains. Now, obviously, there's a lot of, it's not straightforward to compute this, and there's a whole literature providing tools to compute this share, but we see that this series has behaved very similarly than the share of world trade. It grew a lot in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s and reached a level higher than 50%. More than 50% of world trade was accounted for by global value chain trade. You know, the parts and components and finished products that flow and services that flow through value chains. Now you see that after the Great Recession, it went down, it picked up, but not much. And there seems to be a decline in recent years. But let me point out that the last year of this series that's available is 2015. If I go back to the previous year, you'll see up to 2015, these things had slowed down too. It wouldn't be crazy that when we update the GVC levels to values for 16, 2017, 2018, we would have seen a similarly rebound here. So I don't really think that up to this point, there's much systematic evidence other than a bunch of anecdotal evidence indicating that firms are retrenching and going back to their local economies. There's a lot of talk of it. There's a lot of examples of firms that have done that or have tried to do so. But when you look at aggregate statistics, this is just simply not adding up. We can look at other measures of globalization like migration flows. Do we see people migrating less than in the past? Absolutely not. In 2019, migration flows were at their all-time high, in part because of refugee problems. So it's not something we should cheer, but there's certainly no sense in which people are migrating less than in the past. We could look at capital flows, and lots of people point at capital flows to say, look, capital flows are nowhere near their levels at the onset of the Great Recession. And that is true. Certainly that hasn't gone back up, and there's a marked decline in the last 10 years or so, but there's a lot of macro factors that explain this. Okay, and I'm really not gonna touch much upon that. I'm happy to take questions in the Q&A. I'm not really a macroeconomist, but I don't think that I would infer too much about the future of globalization based on this series related to capital flows. We can look at measures of multinational activity, and up to 2016, again, this comes with a bit of a lag. We also see a mild decline in recent years, but back to levels around 2004. Okay, so still we live in a world that is much more globalized than it was in the 70s and 80s. So to take stock up to this point, the point I want to convey is that there's no conclusive evidence of significant deglobalization in recent years. The case for globalization is indeed clear. It's very clear that things have slowed down relative to previous decades. And I've also argued that the observed slowdown at some level was inevitable. So it's not the natural sequel of an unsustainable increase in the period 86 to 2008. So what I want to do next is precisely to dig into this period, try to understand what happened then and why these forces are not working anymore. And again, trying to forecast how those forces, these same forces, might play out in the future. Now, I'm going to distinguish between three types of forces, which I think were key forces in the what I'm going to call the hyper-globalization period of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. On the one hand, we have technological factors, which for explaining hyper-globalization, we often call this the ICT, or information and communication technology revolution. Increase in the computing power of computers, in our ability to transmit information at long distances through fiber optic cables and so on. All these technological developments basically enhanced the ability of firms in industrialized countries to fragment production, locate relatively labor-intensive parts of production in countries with relatively low wages, while still maintaining a good amount of coordination. Okay, distance was not as costly as it had been in the past, thanks to the ability of having these powerful computers and ways to transmit information that were not available before, the internet, for instance. So that's on the technology side. Then there was obviously also institutional developments. And here, what I have in mind is a reduction not just in the cost of communication, but in the cost of shipping goods across borders. The period of the 80s and 90s are periods of significant preferential trade liberalization within Europe, with the inclusion of Southern European countries, Eastern European countries, in North America with NAFTA in the mid-90s, in South America with Mercosur in the also mid-90s. And then in Asia, you have the Asian FTA. And of course, in 2001, there's China's entry into the WTO. So in the same period in which communication was becoming cheaper, the flow of goods was also becoming cheaper. The third factor is somewhat institutional, but it's more like, I'd say, political in nature. And that's basically a dramatic increase in the share of the world labor force that became employable from the point of view of firms in industrialized countries. Okay, so let me show you quickly some graphs to kind of illustrate this. So on the one hand, you have the ICT revolution. This is, for instance, I'm showing you Moore's law, which is associated with a very marked increase of the number of transistors you can put in a chip. And you see that this law holds just as strong today as it did in the past. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this, but if we thought of Moore's law as the fuel of this is still going quite strong. Okay, although I'm going to put a caveat on that. We also see, in terms of the number of internet users as a share of world population, this is on the log scale, you see that there was a very marked increase in the share of people that had access to internet. And we're not quite at 100%, but we're getting there, and that's naturally why the rate of growth of internet adoption is going down. Trade liberalization, this preferential trade agreements, I could show you a bunch of agreements or spaghetti bowl of agreements. Let me just show you a measure of trade protection, which is a world average tariff, unweighted world average tariff. You see that it went down quite dramatically from 15–16% in the 60s, all the way down to below 6% before the recent trade tensions. Okay, so, and the bulk of that increase, notice, is happening in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, which is the period of liberalization that I was mentioning. The politics, what do I have in mind? Obviously, China opening up since '79. To some extent, India also liberalizing. Naturally, from the point of view of Europe, the fall of socialism or communism in Eastern Europe, that was a very dramatic development. So the sheer size of these countries just implies that about 40 to 45% of the world labor force in 1990, which had been outside the capitalist system, all of a sudden entered the capitalist system. So you have this coexistence of labor demand or foreign labor demand shocks. As firms in industrialized countries, they were more likely to seek foreign labor because they could communicate more easily with them. They could ship goods back and forth more cheaply. And at the same time that labor demand was going up, labor supply was also going up, and going up big time with the inclusion of these countries in the capitalist system. So the punchline is, that because of these developments, as I just said, there was a large increase in foreign labor demand, foreign labor supply, and all these things work together. And in addition, because they were perceived to be permanent shocks, nobody expected, at least at that point in time, that A, the ICT revolution was going to disappear, B, that we would enter anytime soon a process of trade protection or increased trade protection, and C, nobody expected countries to kind of roll back to socialism. Well, that obviously led firms to change or kind of drastically change their organization of production, and were more likely to seek foreign suppliers, foreign workers, and set up this truly global value chains. Now, what I want to do next is, I've told you about technological factors. I want to tell you, I talked about institutional factors and political factors, and I want to, zoom in on this and see where we are now, and to what extent these factors have now contributed to the slowdown of globalization, and more importantly, perhaps, to what extent the same factors might lead us to a process of deglobalization. So I'm going to start with technological factors. Is the ICT revolution over? The answer seems to be no, in the sense that I showed you that Moore's law up to 2019 is still going super strong. I mean, the first point that I should make is yes, but it's coming at an increasingly high cost. For instance, recent work by Nick Bloom at Stanford has shown that the amount of resources that companies in the semiconductors industry need to put in to achieve that yield has gone up quite significantly. So it's getting harder and harder to keep up with this so-called law. More relevantly, and also in terms of internet spread, obviously, if you think about the spread of the internet as a fuel to the globalization period, that obviously had a natural upper bound, because that is a percentage, right? I mean, at some point, everybody or just about everybody is going to be connected, and then we cannot find anybody else unless we start exploring other planets and things like that. But that's for another day, I guess. That would take us off track. Now, I do want to talk not just about the ICT revolution, but I want to talk about technological developments that have been discussed in recent years and that have led people to hypothesize that although indeed that the ICT revolution was a very much a globalization-inducing revolution, that the new technological developments we're seeing are de-globalization-inducing developments. So what do people have in mind? They have in mind automation or industrial robots. They have in mind 3D printing. People talk about digital technologies. People talk about blockchain. I don't think there's a lot of people that talk about digital technologies and blockchain as things that will de-globalize. I think it's fairly uncontroversial to argue that those are things that are going to reduce transaction costs and probably will enhance globalization as they become more and more widespread. The case for automation and 3D printing is different. Take the case of automation, right? So the standard narrative here is to say, look, firms in industrialized countries, they went abroad because they were seeking lower wages. They wanted to hire workers and pay them lower wages than the wages they were paying to their local workers. Now, automation has been documented to be a labor replacing technological change. That is, you take things that workers used to do and now you have robots do them. And obviously, that's going to change that trade-off, and it might make some firms bring things back because they don't care about wages as much as in the past. Now, I have somewhat of a different view on this, actually. I am not convinced, either conceptually or empirically, that automation is going to lead to deglobalization. And that's basically for two reasons. On the conceptual side, we need to understand that robots, they cannot do everything. They cannot produce goods out of thin air. That is, they're good at assembling things. They're really good at some things, but really bad at others. So when firms, they automate, that tends to increase their productivity. And that productivity increase is going to lead to increases in scale, which is going to lead firms to increase their demand for materials, parts and components that perhaps the robots are putting together. And this scale effect, this productivity effect, could actually lead to an increase in intermediate input usage up to the point where trade flows might actually go up if some of those parts and components are coming from abroad because for the standard reasons of comparative advantage, they can be produced more cheaply abroad than at home. So this complementarity or this productivity effects could actually change dramatically the effect of automation. And that's indeed my interpretation of available empirical studies that, if anything, indeed suggest a positive effect, not a negative effect, a positive effect of automation on trade flows. That's been conducted, World Bank studies at the industry level, and even folks have been using at firm level information where tracing a causal link between automation and trade is easier. And they're indeed systematically finding a positive effect of automation on trade flows. So I'm not convinced, obviously automation might change what gets done in certain places, will replace some things. But when we think about aggregate trade flows or globalization, I'm not convinced that this is going to be a big deal or a very negative factor. The other technological factor I'm going to talk about, I do want to save some time for institutional factors and political factors, is a point that is often missed. We tend to think about, globalization and de-globalization in a symmetric way. Wages were high at home, we went abroad, we made all these investments to go abroad. And now that wages grow in China or that there's been a trade war, we're going to come back the same way that we went. And I think that's the wrong way to think about things. And it's the wrong way to think about things because we need to understand that in setting global value chains, firms incur very large fixed costs that are often sunk in nature. You set up a plant, you invest in sort of finding right workers, et cetera. All these investments, if you were to move back, you're not going to recoup much of that investment. So firms still went and did that in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Why? Because the shocks were very large and they were perceived to be permanent. For things to retrench, we're going to need two things. We're going to need shocks that are large. And yes, the Great Recession was a large shock. Yes, the US-China trade war was a big shock. And yes, COVID is the mother of all shocks. But are these permanent shocks? It's not so clear. I think firms have been waiting to see to what extent these shocks are really permanent shocks. So in the presence of sunk costs, it's been documented in the academic literature that this creates some hysteresis, it takes really a lot for firms to re-optimize their global value chain. So I have no doubt that in corporate boards worldwide, there's lots and lots of talk of retrenching, bringing stuff back. But when firms start to crunch some numbers and figure out the investments that it would take to actually reorganize production, I think many of them are actually going to wait it out and figure out to what extent the tensions, the institutional factors that I'm about to talk about are likely to be permanent or not. And if they're not likely to be permanent, they're actually going to wait it out. And I don't expect a big amount of de-globalization in recent years. So let me then talk about this, and incidentally, this is not just conceptual point. Again, it's backed by evidence. Folks that looked at the Great Recession, which was a very large shock, we don't observe that this led to very significant reorganization of production. Even folks that have been looking at COVID, there's not much evidence that that's generated a big reorganization of production, at least at this point in time. And I'm happy to talk more about this later. I'm not sure I'm going to have time to go over the COVID slides, but I'm happy to take questions in the Q&A. Let me spend the last few minutes on policy factors, okay, which I think is what many people have in mind. And first, let's be upfront. The environment in 1999 or 2005 was very different than the environment today. There are clear signs of growing protectionism, and there's three particularly worrisome developments in the last 2 to 3 years. First, the multilateral liberalization agenda is pretty much dead. The WTO has made close to no progress in the last couple of decades. Second, the process of regional trade liberalization, which remember was so important in the period of hyperglobalization, not only has stalled, that is, we haven't seen the type of trade agreements that we had seen in the past, but there's also signs that they're actually starting to move in reverse. Two examples would be obviously Brexit in the European context, but also to some extent, this new NAFTA, the USMCA, is a step back from the original NAFTA. So there seems to be a sense in which we are deliberalizing, or there's some initial signs of deliberalizing. The third development, obviously, of worrisome is the US-China trade war. which even with the new US administration, there's no clear signs that this is going to end anytime soon. So these are the developments. But again, if we want to understand to what extent is this going to lead to increased tensions that are not just now, but in a permanent way, which is what I've argued a second ago, is what would trigger a true process of deglobalization, we need to understand what generated all this, what was behind this, and other factors that led to this likely to stick around and create and make this forces more permanently relevant. So what are the underlying drivers? There's many drivers to this to these developments, but I would highlight basically two. One is the fact that trade liberalization or trade integration has been massively beneficial to many individuals and many countries, but it has been much less beneficial and even detrimental to some individuals and even some countries. There's been distributive, very significant distributive effects of trade where some have gained a lot and others have actually lost with it. And this, coupled with the fact that we haven't had appropriate compensation of those that didn't benefit from the process, has led many people to feel alienated by this phenomenon. Okay, so we see that, for instance, in the US, if you look at indices of, how good you think globalization is, or how much trade is a threat or an opportunity for you, you basically see that in the 2000s there was a very marked increase in the perceptions of this being a threat. Now, interestingly, things have changed a lot in the last few years. If you look at the same polls that would indicate that globalization was viewed less and less positively, in recent years, actually globalization has more support than ever before. Okay, some folks, there's been debates about how reliable these indices are, and some folks say that they're actually not capturing a very significant discontent among the population. Okay, why? And why has there been this discontent, and why might this explain the rise of Trump in the US, the rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil, so on and so forth? And again, I think the issue here is clear, which is on the one hand, there's a myriad of studies that have documented that process of trade liberalization, either unilateral trade liberalization or the so-called China shock in the US, have generated very negative impact on certain types of workers or certain types of individuals. And our safety net, the system of transfers has not, or the system of taxation has not been progressive enough, or has not been good enough at identifying those that were losing from this process and made ways or try to kind of improve their well-being. One number that I always find it sort of absolutely mind-boggling is in the US, for instance, work by Otto et al. That looked at the China shock. They show that employment, there's very significant employment declines associated with the rise of China, of the rise of imports from China. And those workers in the US, they saw very little compensation. There was very little transfers going their way through trade assistance programs. The bulk of the assistance came through disability insurance. That is, workers claiming disability and then essentially exiting the labor market, which is a very costly way to compensate workers that instead of claiming to or actually being disabled, they should be retraining or finding ways to get reinserted into the labor market. That has generated negative outcomes, that has generated discontent, and that has generated voters, basically voting candidates, voting parties that have had very clear anti-globalization stances. Are these forces something that happened in the 2010s and we're going to forget about? I'm not so sure. I've argued that the technological factors that drove hyperglobalization might lead to a new wave of globalization. Digital technologies, blockchain, even automation, that can actually give globalization a second wind. But the same developments, I do believe they're likely to aggravate the very extreme distributive effects of trade. They're likely to generate a concentration, an even larger concentration of the gains from trade into the hands of a few, or the few, and less so in the majority. Might we see changes in policy, changes in taxation, or the use of active labor market policies to reduce discontent? Perhaps we might see some initial signs here in the US, but it's still far from obvious that this will go far enough to reduce discontent. So I do see a scenario in which growing discontent is going to lead to the perception that protectionism was not just here for a couple of years, it's here to stay. And that could indeed lead to more significant amount of GVC retrenching or renationalization. Last word, and I know I'm out of time. We can talk more in the Q&A. Is obviously the issue of are we facing a new maybe a cold war between the U.S. and China? Here, the point is obvious. I mean, we talk about the U.S.-China trade war. This is not a trade war. This is a war, is a technology war that is fought. The weapons with which we're fighting that war, they happen to be trade instruments, tariffs. But this is not about trade. This is really about technology. So, there's this deeper issue of how the fit of China is emerging as a world giant. And, there's a state of the world. There's a possibility in which we might find ourselves in a scenario with decoupling, bifurcation of standards, a world with two internets. And this is a scenario that could really lead to the emergence of blocks. And as we know, these are scenarios that are likely to lead to a true process of deglobalization, regionalization, a lot of regional trade, but a lot of breakup of this truly global value chains. Anyway, I'm out of time. I'm going to pause here, and I can tell you about COVID at some other point, or if there's interest, I can get to it, and just conclude, which is, to me, it's not obvious that the world economy is deglobalizing, though there are certainly signs of globalization. I've studied the persistence of the forces that fueled the hyperglobalization of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. To me, it's hard to conclude that technological developments are likely to fuel de-globalization, but there's certainly more reasons for concerns on the policy or institutional side. And that's why I think the main challenge for the future of globalization is not technological, but institutional and political in nature. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Antràs. This is fascinating. Let me ask the first one or two questions in the Q&A. My first question is, inequality is likely to increase after the pandemic. And we have seen how inequality has fueled populism, nationalism, anti-trade sentiment. Under what situations can we still be optimistic about globalization in the post-pandemic world, knowing that governments around the world, in particular those in advanced economies, had failed to redistribute effectively to help, as you said, the losers during globalization to be more pro-trade or at least share some of the benefits of globalization. So, I know in the United States right now, President Biden has been trying hard to redistribute or at least increase the tax on the super rich in the States. How sustainable do you think those policies are going to be? Or should we be more optimistic about those phenomena that what we see in the US will likely be implemented in the rest of the world as well?
Yeah, no, that's that's an excellent question. I think honestly, if you had invited me 2 or 3 weeks ago, I probably would have sided more on your side. I was a bit more pessimistic that we would ever see true action on that front. Certainly here in the US, President Biden has made a strong stance, a capital income tax, income taxation more broadly, corporate taxes. So I think there's the growing sense that this is going to be necessary for the whole globalization process not to unravel. So, faced with the situation where if we don't do that, then we are going to get some other populists to come in and create havoc again. I do think that the pressures that in the past might have explained, or the lobbying, or however we think about what drove, and I skipped that slide, but if you look at tax progressivity in the US, the decline since the 70s is just dramatic, and it's hard to understand because this was a period of very significant increase in the drivers of inequality. At the same time where skilled bias, technical change, and liberalization was leading to large increases in income inequality, the U.S. government was choosing to distribute less from the rich to the poor. So I think that the fact that there was such a big growth early on, if the pie is growing a lot, you don't have to worry too much about redistribution, because even those that are falling a bit behind, they're much, much better than they were in the past. But if growth is going to slow down, and it's clear that world growth is likely to slow down in coming decades, this sort of inequality things become much more salient. So what I'm less sure is whether that's actually going to happen, or whether we're missing the next wave. We're missing the impact that these new technologies could have on the world economy, where might lead us to a new phase of growth. There's a lot of talk about post-COVID boom. Okay, that's more about people having saved all this time and now kind of trying to kind of find ways to use those savings. But maybe there's going to be other factors, this transition to digital technologies, telework and things like that might actually generate a new revolution. And that we know that in processes of very large growth, tensions are always lower, because even those that are lagging behind, they're better off. So I'm not I think you raise a good point, and I'm not sure enough about what average growth is going to be in the next 10 years to know exactly where we're going to be. But if it's meager, yeah, I think that unless tax reform happens, it's going to be hard to not have this thing explode.
Great, thank you. My second question is, I like your sunk cost argument. It's not easy for firms to leave a country after investing a lot, right? For example, I haven't seen a massive reshoring away from China yet. And if you look at all sort of business surveys among American businesses in China, constantly over 90% of them still said, well, China is the market or is a production site for them in the near future. But I have a question about risk aversion, which obviously has increased a lot during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, the key word in global supply chain management is just in time. And as we have heard a lot in discussions, some of the firms have regretted to focus so much on just in time, and they hope that they have think more about just in case in preparation for a pandemic like what we had last year, as well as the escalating geopolitical tension. Do you think in the foreseeable future, the concept of just in case will be more emphasized for new supply chain development, and that would actually make global trade and supply chains more fragmented or more regionalized?
So you said a key word there, which is new investments, right? So I do think that reorganizing an existing value chain is going to be costly. When you need to kind of set it from scratch, these are things that you might absolutely take more into account. I would say that this is going to work better for some sectors than others. There are some sectors that even if you incur new investments, they're very sizable. You require some parts and components that require very specific plans. You can't just sort of go and find a supplier anywhere to do this for you. And part of the reason why firms were not diversified is not because they did not anticipate big shocks. I mean, we've had a lot of big shocks. We had a big earthquake in Japan. We had the Great Recession where lots of firms went under. Firms have seen a fairly volatile environment for some time now. And we still did not see a lot of diversification or growth in diversification. And I may be wrong, but I think part of the reason is because when they went and crunched some numbers, they realized that by sourcing or multi-sourcing was not something that they could easily make happen, profitably make happen. Now, this is again putting more fuel into that view. So I'm sure that on the margin, there are going to be companies that are going to do that. And for some sectors, maybe they should have done it before, and it's a no-brainer now. How much that's going to aggregate, I don't know. I do believe that GVCs tend to be very often in highly concentrated, high scale economy sectors. So I'm not sure that's going to aggregate. Even if it happens, I'm not sure how much that's going to aggregate to. You know, if you think about the auto industry or other industries, there's a lot of scale economies involved there.
Great, thank you.
Yes, I agree. In some sectors, yes. How many and how much that's going to aggregate, I'm less sure.
Thank you, Paul. There are over 20 questions in the Q&A chat room. I will try to ask 3 or 4 of them. A common question that has been raised in the chat room is about your GVC graph. In the interest of time, you probably didn't have time to explain what is behind the construction of those indexes. So the first question related to that is, what does that capture? And second, what factors drove the slowdown of the GVC development according to the graph?
So, you know, it's not my measure. This is a measure that was suggested by a couple of researchers at the Bank of Italy, Borin and Mancini. You know, the definition is very simple. It's an estimate of the percentage of world trade that flows through more than one border. Okay, so in the traditional conceptualization of trade flows, going back to David Ricardo, you'd have a country like Portugal growing, you know, wine and then shipping that wine to other countries, and other countries sort of using labor and capital to produce cotton or something and then exporting it. In the modern world, we often see countries produce parts and components that are sent to some other country where they're further processed, and that further process leads to a new, more complex part that then maybe is sent to an assembly plant. So the initial value added that came in the first country is going from the home country to a foreign country, and then from the foreign country is going to a third country. So what they're trying to do is use a combination of very, very detailed trade data that basically comes from customs offices. It's a transaction level data, aggregated at the finely disaggregated product level, together with what we call input-output tables, which are produced by national statistics. So with that and some assumptions, some sort of tools, you can basically come up with estimates of how much the world is a traditional world in which value added only crosses one border once, as in David Ricardo's world, or how much does it cross more than one border? And you know that statistic is showing that more and more a country's exports are embodying value added that is not from their own country, but is actually is originally from other countries and embodied in your exports in parts and components that are stuck into your exports. So that was the what it is. What is it? The question of why did it go down or slow down? So I'm not entire. I mean, I think part of the reason obviously is the great collapse, the trade collapse, 2008, 2009. That was a big drop, and I think some of this international links were just broken, and it takes a long time to recreate them. And the local links are easier to kind of connect. Another explanation, which I think, you know, I'm almost tempted to ask Professor Tang to answer or to kind of speak on is obviously the notion that China's been what we call moving up the value chain. You know, it at the beginning of its takeoff, it did a lot of this thing of bringing parts and components from foreign countries, doing some simple processing to it, and then shipping it over. And more, you know, Chinese industrial structure has been becoming better and better at actually capturing comparative advantage in segments that were higher up the chain. And Professor Tang has a very nice paper documenting this. And that naturally would also contribute to this reduction in the share of trade that is GVC trade. Now, how much of each, I'm not sure. I think they're both factors that drive this. But as I said, I mean, when we get data up to 2020, I'm convinced the share of world trade that is GVC trade today is probably where we were in 2008. It's not lower than that. It's slowed down. It's sort of stopped at that high level, but I'm not sure that as of today, it's any higher. And certainly COVID has made it higher. That's for sure.
Thank you. A question about regional trade agreements. One of them asked, why do you say USMCA as a step back towards protectionism? Adding on that, I would like to ask your opinion about RCEP. Do you see RCEP as a threat to multilateral trade systems, or it may complement more multilateral efforts, including non-member countries joining RCEP, or it would provide some pressure on the WTO to implement the necessary reforms?
What is the last thing you're saying, RCEP?
So RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, do you see that as a threat to multilateral trade, or it may actually complement more multilateral partnership, including the necessary reforms that we would like to see within the WTO? So I'm asking two questions. One is about USMCA, the other one is about RCEP.
Good. So on the USMCA, I mean, basically, there's two aspects of it where I think they are implicitly increasing protectionism. One has to do with rules of origin, which basically have increased, think about, if you're a German automaker and you have an assembly plant in Mexico, and you have an assembly plant in Mexico in part because you want to sell cars in the US, but you want to face a bit lower wages. Mexico is beneficial because it's part of NAFTA. So once you produce the car in Mexico, you can ship it to the US at no tariff. Now, obviously, there are these rules to try to exploit this regional trade agreement as a way to bypass tariffs, right? So NAFTA obviously demanded that a certain amount of the German car, a certain percentage of the value added of the car, had to be produced in NAFTA countries. Okay, so maybe the German company, say Volkswagen, could export, send them the engine from Germany, but then the other parts of the car, to get to the percentage of NAFTA value added that was demanded, other parts had to be in the NAFTA area. Now that percentage has gone up in the new NAFTA, and it's gone up to the point where it might affect the ability of this, say, German automakers to actually be able to still produce the engine in Germany. Okay, so that's a form of protectionism because they're trying to redirect activity towards NAFTA, okay, at the expense of other countries. But that could take us to a longer conversation. I'm not so sure that's actually going to work out. I mean, a natural response of the German automaker, Volkswagen in that case, would be, look, you guys are making it so complicated for me to operate this value chain that I'm just going to focus on my European value chain. I'm going to ship you my finished cars. I know you're going to slap a tariff on it, but at least you're not distorting my value. I need to get the engines from Germany. There's just no way around that. So that's for a different day, maybe. But that's one sense in which I think USMCA is a step back relative to NAFTA. There's also issues of, sunset clauses and this thing that we're going to have to be renegotiating this over and over, which is, opening the door for political pressures down the line to create some murkiness. But that's a different issue. On your second point, honestly, I'm not sure I have a very, you're asking the broader question of how do we think about regional trade integration and how does it overlap with multilateral or global trade integration? And as you know, I mean, this is something that was debated quite extensively in the 80s. I think one thing that is different at this point in time and back in the day, people like, Judge Bagwadi and others were arguing, let's not have all these regional trade agreements because they're basically going to make it impossible to reach agreements at the WTO level. They're raising the stakes in a way that it's impossible to make progress at the WTO. And other people's like Dick Baldwin was saying, well, it's not so clear, I mean, maybe some people sign these preferential trade agreements and other people will want to be falling behind, and they are more likely to actually willingly get into the WTO because the cost of not being there is higher. Now that made a lot of sense back then, but now it's 20 years where the multilateral system has not made no progress. So any effect of new regional trade agreements making it harder that the Doha round will be, I mean, this to me is like, cannot be that important anymore. That is dead. So any progress we can make is probably welcome. Now, if that interacts with, this Cold War or this sort of bifurcation, that's the part where things could get tricky, where regional trade integration is not just we liberalize ourselves, but we liberalize and seek standards that isolate us from others. That's dangerous liberalization. But I'm not sure that's the case here.
Great. Let me ask the last question, and this is more like a IMF macro type question, and that is, what do you see as the future of trade in 3 different regions: Europe, Asia, and North America? So basically, we talked about RCEP, which obviously is the biggest, most exciting event about trade within this region. But how about Europe, where you were originally from, or North America, where you're in right now? Do we see more regional trade, or there would be hope that the cross-Atlantic trade or cross-Pacific trade will revive to the pre-pandemic level, partly due to the consolidation of regional trade that we have been talking about in the last hour?
So now it's the bit of the presentation where you asked me to do some astrology.
Yeah.
Europe. I mean, Europe is in a bit of a delicate situation for a variety of reasons. I mean, it goes back to the, even though the great financial crisis was largely originated in the US, it was suffered probably in Europe more than anywhere else, and it sort of, the effects lingered for much longer than in other places. So we're already coming from a very big shock. Brexit has basically shaken the European model, and it's itself is going to be disruptive. It's going to lead to reorganization because it's seemingly a permanent change at this point. But this is one of the situations where the slides I had on COVID. I mean, as you know, COVID, in terms of world trade flows, the impact has been was dramatic, but very short-lived. I mean, world trade is looking very strong right now. But in Europe, COVID has aggravated a lot of internal tensions across countries. There were lots of tensions last year in sort of the aid packages and passing the aid. Northern economies trying to not make it a big aid package, southern economies pushing for more. That was a hotly debated issue. And it sort of, again, builds on the Great Recession and bailouts and so on. I mean, this is a recurrent issue. There's a very significant division in philosophy in the north and in the south of Europe on this. And now we've seen it again with vaccines, where it's been absolutely a mess. And there's been a lot of finger pointing. And my sense is that diplomacy, or sort of this glue that pulled Europe together and that led to this extraordinary process of European integration, is really in danger. There's like populist governments in some countries. So I think they'll pull through. Honestly, that's my That's where I put the money, but it's going to be difficult. I don't see a new Brexit or the next who's going to, I don't necessarily see that. I think Germany, France, Italy are very committed to the project, but it's going to be challenging. In North America, I do think that even though I think that on the US-China relationship, Biden is not going to change a lot, change at least materially. Things are not going to change a lot. They might change the forms, obviously, and the rule, a more rules-based approach. But on the substance, I don't think that's going to change much. Within North America, I think not just the form, but the substance might change. Actually, I do think that Biden is more likely to seek enhance integration and reduce tensions with Mexico, with Canada, and I do think that the future there is a little bit more rosy. That's in gross terms where I stand at this point in time.
Thank you so much, Professor Antràs. There's still a lot of great questions, which unfortunately we don't have time to go through. I will send you all the questions so that you get a sense about what our audience are excited about. Now I would like to spend a minute to talk about the next event, as well as talk about AGI generally. Our next public policy webinar will be given by Dr. Deborah Ames, who is the founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center, and she's going to talk about RCEP, game changer for global trade, in 2 weeks on May 25th. Next, please. And don't forget to follow us on different social media platforms on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, as well as Twitter. All right, Professor Antràs, thank you so much for your time. It is late in Boston. We all learned a great deal today about globalization rather than de-globalization. And you have given us a bit of optimism about the future of globalization. Between you and me, obviously I learned everything about trade from you. But I have to say I remain slightly more pessimistic about globalization. And there have been questions about deindustrialization and how disruptive technology may be a threat. But anyhow, we don't have time to discuss further or even to exchange comments. But thank you so much again. Hope you stay safe. And we all look forward to welcoming you to Hong Kong in the near future.
Thank you, Heiwai, and thank you to the Asia Global Institute. And as you said, I hope next time we'll be in person. We're all looking forward to this new phase in the future. Thank you.
Great. Bye for now. Good night.
Good night.